Very happy to be here with you and introducing Astra Taylor. I'm super excited to hear what she has to say. But before we begin, let me describe myself for our visually impaired siblings. As I said, my name is Audrena Redmond. I am an African-American female. I am short, although in my mind I'm tall. I have on a gray sweater and I have salt and pepper hair, and I'm wearing glasses today that are propped up on my beautiful brown skin. And I think I have a lovely smile. So happy to be here with you this morning again. We're going to start with reading our CFA land acknowledgement, and I will do that. We want to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the land of the California indigenous people, California indigenous people past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who've been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the longstanding history that has brought us here to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness, our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important indigenous protocol that we're honoring here today. All right, so we are here today with Astra Taylor of the Debt Collective. Astra, I'm very excited to hear you. You have a long history of both academic, but also community organizing work and definitely issue work, ranging from teasing philosophers to moving to more social, political, economic issues like student debt. And so when you're ready, we're ready.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes, it's such an honor to be here. And I'm going to begin with a visual description. I am Astra Taylor. I am 42 years old, a white woman sitting at my brand new desk where I'm hoping to get some good writing done, with a bookshelf behind me full of some of my favorite books and a poster on the top of that bookshelf with a quote from Emma Goldman. I am a writer and a filmmaker, as was just mentioned, but really, for the last decade have been helping to build a movement of debtor power. And so I'm a co-founder, now organized with a group called the Debt Collective. You can go to the website debtcollective.org, which is the country's first union for debtors. And I am going to talk about some big ideas. I tend to get lost in those, but organizers always have to make an ask. That's part of building power. All of you are in a labor union, so you know that. So I'm actually going to put some up front so that then we can get big picture and philosophical. There is a faculty sign-on letter against student debt. I just put it on my Twitter feed. Astra Disastra is my Twitter. Astra Disastra. There is also, we are hosting a meeting for faculty on the 14th, and I'll post a link to that too. So I just want to say that we really invite everyone listening into the growing movement to cancel student debt. We have an amazing opportunity here in 2022 to actually make some massive progress on that. The Debt Collective, however, though, is not just a student debt organization, though that's what we're most known for, and that's the focus of a lot of our organizing right now. And so in this talk, I want to get into some of the bigger themes and kind of bigger analysis that's motivating us as we try to deliver concrete results for people right now, and push in this moment we have right now, push for student debt cancellation, but towards the horizon of free education. And we always mean free in a double sense. Free as in cost, shouldn't be tuition, In fact, people should get stipends so they can actually live and focus on their studies. But really, free education is aimed at liberation. And for us, a liberating education is one where you're allowed to pursue your interests and learn. You don't have to just worry about studying something so you can pay off your student debt or get a return on investment. But also, a liberating education is one where, you're not being harassed by police on campus, where you're not subject to discrimination of any kind. And so we really think we all deserve that and much more. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and begin. I'm going to open this up with an animation that I worked on last year that was released in partnership with The Intercept, and it was animated by the brilliant Molly Crabapple and her team, and it is called Your Debt is Someone Else's Asset.
The American dream used to be owning your own home. Now it's being debt-free. Altogether, Americans owe a record-breaking $15 trillion and counting. Sold as a lifeline, debt is too often an anchor, dragging people down with compounding interest and fees, pulling wealth and resources from the working class to bloat Wall Street's bottom line. Every debt we hold is someone else's asset, with our monthly payments providing steady revenue streams for greedy creditors. Households with credit card debt pay around $1,155 a year in interest alone. Americans now die owing an average of $62,000, much of it credit card debt. A significant amount of the $770 billion of credit card debt sloshing around is medical bills, ambulance rides, doctor's visits, and surgeries paid for with the swipe of a little plastic card. Then there's the additional $140 billion of medical debt and collections, combined with an estimated $50 billion in back rent and $1.4 trillion in auto loans. Much of this debt didn't exist a few generations ago. Consider the $1.8 trillion in student loans this country now holds, which wasn't a problem in the 1960s when college was often free, or close to it. Ronald Reagan helped change that. He made his name by demonizing protesters on the University of Berkeley campus. In 1967, as governor of California, he pushed the university system to start charging students tuition so they would, quote, think twice about whether they wanted to pay to carry a picket sign. During his career as senator, Joe Biden advanced Reagan's project, working to expand student lending. As a senator from Delaware, the credit card industry capital, Biden was a devoted servant of the financial sector. He fought relentlessly for 2005 legislation that weakened borrower protections and made bankruptcy more difficult for regular borrowers, strengthening the hand of the student loan and credit card industries and helping cause a wave of home foreclosures. But debt is not just about money. It's about power. Debt has long been both a source of profit and a tool of social control and racial domination. The founding fathers knew this. Thomas Jefferson argued that debt should be canceled after natural limits, which he took to be about a generation, but only for white men like himself. In 1803, he wrote that debt should be used as a weapon against indigenous people to steal their territory. We shall be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. Sharecropping, redlining, predatory lending all continued this trend, deepening racial inequities. As a result of the 2008 mortgage crisis, Black and brown families lost upwards of 50% of their collective wealth. For regular debtors, even a late payment can spell disaster. A tanked credit score can make it impossible to rent an apartment or get a job. Default on your student loans? The government can seize your wages, tax refunds, and Social Security. Debtors' prisons are technically unconstitutional, but in practice, people struggling to pay medical bills or court fees can wind up in jail. But not all debtors are treated so cruelly. Rich people regularly walk away from their obligations, and companies engage in strategic defaults. The banks that crashed the economy in 2008, they got bailed out. Donald Trump, the self-professed king of debt, left a string of corporate bankruptcies in his wake. And don't forget that during the COVID pandemic, the federal government spent hundreds of billions of dollars buying up bad corporate debt belonging to entities including Exxon and Walmart, and offering companies, including payday lenders, forgivable loans. It's time regular debtors got a break, too. It's time for a jubilee, the erasure of debts and a rebalancing of power between regular people and elites. It's not a new idea. Jubilee was described in the Bible, and many ancient civilizations had periodic jubilees to avert social and economic collapse. Our earliest recorded histories are stone tablets inscribed with credit ledgers. Nearly as long as debt has existed, debt cancellation has existed too. Throughout history, debtors have risen up to demand relief. In the early 6th century BCE, a debtors' riot helped nudge ancient Athens towards democracy. The reforms, known as the shaking off of burdens, included debt absolution and an end to debt bondage. Something similar happened in ancient Rome after debtors mounted the world's first general strike. In the United States, indebted workers and farmers revolted in the colonial era, and then again during the Great Depression. Later, the call for debt cancellation rang out at Occupy Wall Street. In recent years, striking debtors helped force the government to cancel billions of dollars in student loans. Abolishing medical debt, back rent, and student loans would free up money now spent on debt servicing for other things. People could buy homes and start families, and the racial wealth gap would narrow. Research estimates that canceling student debt alone would boost the economy by up to $108 billion a year and create 1 million jobs. Under pressure from activists, President Biden campaigned on a promise to cancel an immediate minimum of $10,000 of student debt per borrower. Thanks to the Higher Education Act of 1965, he has the power to cancel all federal student loans. With a single signature on an executive order, President Biden can free people from student debt, giving tens of millions of people their lives and futures back. Now, we need to make him do it, and much more. We deserve nothing less than a jubilee.
All right. A lot in there. It's time traveling, condensing a few thousand years of history. But I think it's important to take that long view and to see the way that debt has been used as this dual tool of profit making and also of power, right? Of entrenching power. And part of debt's power is that it doesn't just put people in financial duress, but there's an ideology attached to it, right? A shame and stigma where debtors are made to feel ashamed, they're made to feel bad, made to feel guilty. My old friend, the late and great anthropologist David Graeber, who was around at the founding of our movement in Occupy Wall Street, often pointed out that the German word for debt also means guilt. And so those associations are really strong and still really powerful. So part of what we're trying to do as a movement is to cast away that shame and stigma. And one of our slogans, and I think it's a really powerful one, is this: people do not live beyond their means. They are denied the means to live. The people who should be ashamed are not debtors who have to borrow to make ends meet because they don't make enough to live, but rather the people who profit from poverty and perpetuate poverty. Just an overview of where we're at. As I said in the animation, 73% of people in the United States die in debt. A lot of that's credit cards. Credit cards cover basic necessities. There's lots of stereotypes about what people put on credit cards. The fact is most people are putting food, they're putting rent, they're putting medical bills, as I say. Those medical bills, of course, are a major driver of bankruptcy. And it's always important to point out that this is not a problem in other countries. In Canada, medical debt doesn't exist. It certainly isn't a leading cause of homelessness. And always, given the way our society is structured, these impacts are not felt equally. So one thing we say in the Debt Collective's book, and a manifesto really, it's called Can't Pay, Won't Pay, the Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition, is debt is the tie that binds the 99%, but it doesn't bind everyone equally. So it can be a real source of solidarity, but we also have to recognize its differential impacts. So, looking at the Great Recession, Black families lost 50% of their collective wealth. Latinx families lost 67%. I mean, absolutely incredible dispossession by the financial sector. Right now, student debt is $1.8 trillion. Again, why is there student debt? It's because we do not have free education. So people are forced to individually debt finance, which should be a public good. And this is a political choice. California is obviously at the center of this with Ronald Reagan and his attacks, conscious attacks on student movements, both free speech, civil rights, anti-war movements happening. Also the emerging Black Power movements. These were campus movements pushing back. And he basically said, and this is essentially a quote, make them pay and they'll think twice about holding a picket sign. This is, the double benefit for the people in power of a tuition, individually debt financed education system is that it has a disciplinary function, right? You'll think twice about holding that picket sign because you're going into debt for your education. So someone's profiting, but also, you'll ideally be a more docile worker at the end of it. So debt is just widely, this is a huge problem for people. And it manifests in lots of ways. And one thing that we also like to push back on is the idea of the sort of thinking about debt as an individual problem, but also thinking of these types of debt separately. For us, student debt is connected to medical debt, is connected to credit card debt, is connected to what we call carceral debt. Carceral debt meaning all the different types of debts that are incurred through contact with the criminal punishment system. And I think it's important to just talk a little bit about the moment we're in, debt under COVID-19. So it was actually last year that household debt across this country, again, in the newspapers, you often see it described as consumer debt. We reject that frame and talk about household debt because these debts were not just consumers. It's hard to consider carceral debt, for example, a kind of consumer debt or education debt, consumer debt, but also that we use the word household debt because these are never just individual obligations. They affect our families. We take out debts for people we love. But so debt overall has surpassed $15 trillion. That's record breaking. People got a bit of relief with some of the pandemic forbearance programs, but also it's very telling to us that folks spent on average a significant amount of their stimulus checks on debt repayments. And so what that meant was that basically people's stimulus checks were basically a bailout for creditors because they spent something like 30%. We have not yet been able to do a full tallying of the amount of medical debt that will come out of this crisis. It's going to be mind-boggling. And as I've already said, that medical debt will lead to housing insecurity, will compound the woes of millions of families. And already we're thinking, that the lower estimates say that Americans are in hock for something like $20 billion in past due back rent debt. So pretty incredible. So from education to housing, carceral debt, utility bills, household debts, an all-time high. This is a systemic condition. Debt is not the product of poor choices. It is the product of a broken, unjust, very profitable system. And systemic conditions require systemic responses. This is not something where we can just be good debtors, scrimp and save and get out of this. So systemic condition. I always like to show this drawing. This is a drawing from Molly Crabapple, but from 2012. So she's been on the edge of this movement for a long time. This is the debts of JP Morgan and just shows how this financial entity has its tentacles in all of these different areas of our lives. So even these debts that feel very disparate, very unique, they're actually all connected in a bigger financial web. And for us as organizers, that's interesting because that means we have common creditors, we have common problems. This system emerged, again, it was a political choice. So the reason I think it's important to take that long view going back into the ancient world is, debt is not new. Debt in a way is older than capitalism, but something did shift. There are these, historic shifts in the 20th century. For example, the New Deal era, when the white middle class was able to grow on the basis of access to affordable federally subsidized credit in the forms of mortgages that overwhelmingly went to white families, built the white middle class. So then decades later in the 70s, what happens? There's another political shift. Reagan really embodies it. We can talk about this as, shift into neoliberalism or financialization, but what we like to say at the Debt Collective is this moment, financialization is experienced for regular people as the age of debt. Access to credit is democratized, but often on predatory terms. Meanwhile, taxes are cut, so social spending is slashed, wages start stagnating, unions are under attack, right? All these things that drive people to have to borrow more to fill the gap because they're making less at work, there's less social services to rely on, and so on. Again, the story really is interesting when you look at California. Reagan was a big proponent of the tax the tax revolt movement that kind of took off in the 70s in California, and he rode the wave of tax revolts into the White House, right? Wealthier, affluent, very rich people, a wide swath of folks were like, we don't want to pay taxes anymore. Why should we have to pay for other people's well-being? And so one frame we like to play with too is, well, when, yes, the wealthy go on tax strike. And so what do people who don't have assets, what can they do? Well, debt strikes are an option. That's what we mean by economic disobedience. So collective systemic problems require systemic solutions, and our concept is debtors unions. And so great to talk to people in a labor union. I mean, we take inspiration from the labor movement. We think these are complementary forms of power. But just as workers need to organize to exercise collective power in the workplace against the boss, debtors also need to organize against common creditors who are sometimes the state. That's part of the neoliberal reality we're in, because student loans, for example, some people have private loans, but that's a minority of people. The vast majority of student loans are held by the federal government with some private loan servicers mediating them. So sometimes our targets are government, sometimes they're private sector, often they're merged. But debtors don't share a factory floor, they don't share a workplace, so we have to find each other in different ways. So we're a very distributed movement. But what's interesting about that, it makes it challenging to organize, but it also means you get an interesting cross-section of people whose what they have is what they share in common is their indebtedness, but they live in different places. They live in rural places, urban places, they're young, they're old. And this is a formation, again, that can work in solidarity with all sorts of existing movements, the labor movement, movements for economic justice, racial justice, all sorts of things that we need. And once you start seeing that, I think this is important, you start seeing it everywhere. So one thing I like to say is we're not asking you to think about debt as a new issue area, another thing you have to worry about, whether what's important is the way webs of finance, relationships of debt and credit are already implicated in the things you're concerned about. If you teach at a public university, for example, chances your institution is in debt. You teach at a public K through 12 school, that's probably the case as well. If you work at a hospital, your patients are going into debt for your treatment. So debt is everywhere. Okay, so your debt is someone else's asset. This is the key insight, I think, in the shift. For me, this epiphany first came about in an early at Occupy Wall Street, second or third day, when I heard a young man say, step right up and write down what you are worth to the 1%. So all these folks were stepping up, and he had a big piece of butcher block paper and writing down how much debt they had. And this caused me a lot of strife at the moment. I had just defaulted on my student loans a couple of years prior. But what was so pivotal about that was first the collective aspect, that we were all writing it down, and I got to see this thing that was typically invisible, how much the people around me owed in medical bills and medical and healthcare bills and housing debt. But also the way he phrased it, how much are you worth? He didn't ask how much do you owe, but how much are you worth? And that made me realize, oh, hold on, my debt is a form of profit. So we take inspiration from J.P. Getty, the industrialist. If you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. So together we own the proverbial bank. Another thing we like to say, alone our debts are a burden, but together they make us powerful. This is just the basic idea of solidarity, right? All of us who are organizing together recognize this. But in our case, we're specifically saying, look, together, this money adds up, these assets matter. So this is, again, where we kind of got our start. 2011 Occupy. This is another one of our slogans. You are not alone, A_LOAN, but meaning we're in this together. So we, some of the founders of this movement organized a day called 1T Day, which was the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion. We're now at 1.8 again. And rapidly racing towards 2 trillion. So at 1T Day, Joe Biden was the vice president under Obama. He's now the president. And in some ways, we've made tremendous progress pushing the idea of student debt cancellation, showing that it's possible. We won billions of dollars of relief at this point. At the same time, though, just because of the way compound interest works, the amount of money people owe has grown at this outrageous rate. And so we have a real crisis on our hands. Where will we be? How did we get to the point where we've won billions of dollars of relief, where a president who spent his career as a senator of Delaware serving the banking sector campaigned on canceling some student debt, not enough, but some. Well, we did that by organizing relentlessly, including organizing the world's first student debt strike. This is a picture. It began with just 15 people. They were students of a predatory for-profit college. The Debt Collective collaborated with them. We called them the Corinthian 15. We organized a debt strike coupled with a legal strategy that helped people exercise rights that were basically impossible to exercise before, a right that says if you were defrauded by your school, you were entitled to debt cancellation. So through this channel, we have won through that channel alone over $4 billion, billion with a B, dollars of debt cancellation. It's the main means that the Biden administration is currently canceling student debt. And that's all the work of activists. So these are just some of the headlines. A student debt revolt begins. And this is just a little message that someone got saying that their debt was canceled. Then in 2019, some of the Corinthian strikers, and this is Pamela Hunt, who's one of them, spoke at the College for All announcement in DC.
Hello. My name is Pam Hunt. I have $212,000 of student debt, $51,000 of which is interest alone. I stand before you as a person who pursued a higher degree and was made worse off because of it. I'm a proud single parent, and like so many parents, I have worked hard to make sure that my children have the best lives that they can have. I came to Washington, D.C. in 2015 as one of the first student debt strikers in U.S. history. We organized for years, and as a result, some debtors won relief, although I haven't. Over the last 4.5 years, I have struggled financially due to my student debt burden. I lost my home and nearly lost my life in a fight against cancer. But you know what I haven't lost? These illegitimate and immoral student loans that are still haunting me. You know what else I also haven't lost? I haven't lost myself or my desire to fight. I am here to fight, no matter how long it takes, for full debt cancellation and an education system that treats us with dignity and as equals. An education system that's worth fighting for. Right now, many people are not paying back their student loans because they cannot afford to. I've heard that we can't afford to let people go to school for free, but from where I stand, we can't afford not to. I have 3 daughters who, within the past 4 years, have graduated from college with Bachelor of Science degrees. Each is starting life with $50,000 plus in student loan debt. None of them are employed in their field of study, and all of them are on income-based repayment because their income doesn't afford them the ability to make monthly payments. That's just my 3 daughters.
So I just wanted to highlight Pam. I mean, she's, again, as she said, one of the first student debt strikers. And because this, we have reached a point where talking about student debt cancellation is totally mainstream. It is one of the main things being discussed. It is one of the, in a political context where a lot of the Biden administration's progressive agenda has been stymied by members of his own party, it is one thing he can still deliver on. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, through executive action. And this would not be on the table if it wasn't for students from predatory for-profit colleges beginning to push the issue, showing that debt cancellation is possible. This is somebody getting their money back. Pam has gotten her student loans from a for-profit college canceled. She still has loans from quote unquote traditional schools. I just want to say we never use the word forgiveness at the Debt Collective. We do not believe debtors did anything wrong. We are demanding justice and abolition. In the Trump era, it was tough. obviously for lots of reasons, but through legal partnerships with the some allies, through litigation, we were able to keep the energy going in winning some debt relief, though not enough. This is just striking because it is Betsy DeVos having to sign a paper granting some debt cancellation. And we just note that she says right here, with extreme displeasure. So again, this whole number through this mechanism is $4 billion, but we love making Betsy DeVos unhappy with extreme displeasure. We have to enjoy that. So again, this movement is what got us to this point. Elizabeth Warren, took the lead on student debt cancellation, especially from a policy perspective. There's, and this really emerged out of what is ultimately, Occupy Wall Street. And we've had to figure out, though, it wasn't just about saying, we need to cancel the debt. We've also had to do all of the policy homework along the way. This is the way you can actually cancel fraudulent for-profit student loans. This is the executive authority you can use via the Higher Education Act to cancel all federal student loans. So this idea that activists are just out there activists disting whatever that is not true. You have to do the thinking for the people in power that you're trying to move as well. And so these are Biden's promises. I want to highlight them because there's actually two. In the animation, I mentioned a minimum, immediate, look at these words, immediate minimum of $10,000 of federal student loan debt for everybody across the board, not means tested, but also forgiving, we reject that word, but all undergraduate tuition related loans for 2- and 4-year public colleges and universities and private HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and MSIs, minority serving institutions, for debt holders under this income threshold. Again, not perfect. There's, especially this was under his campaign proposals related to racial justice. There's lots of evidence that if you want to have the maximum economic impact and racial justice impact, we should cancel all of the debt. But I think it's important to just name these campaign pledges, and that these, again, can be delivered without having to deal with an intransigent Congress. He can do this. So these are just some pictures of some of the events we've been doing over the last year. If you want to thank Black women, says this one photo, cancel student debt. Black women hold the most student debt of any demographic. We are organizing a day of action in DC, April 4th. But people can do things locally. So I want to invite people to do that. And as faculty, we have a special faculty sign-on letter and a meeting coming up, as I mentioned, that I will put in my Twitter. But really, we need solidarity. This is a moment, I think, where we have a unique opportunity to move the needle on this and to begin to start pushing towards that horizon of Jubilee, that rebalancing of power that is so required. So these are some of the other projects that we could talk about in the Q&A a little bit. Again, the Debt Collective doesn't just work on student debt. We've got an abolish bail debt tool focused in California to challenge bail debt that is held by co-signers, meaning people who take on bail debt for their loved ones who are incarcerated. We are working also on the problem of challenging rent debt and evictions in California. We can say more about that. California is an interesting place for us because you have comparatively strong consumer protection laws, ways we can push those even further to build collective power. But alone our debts are a burden, together they make us powerful. Really happy to be presenting on this and happy to go deeper into any aspect of this stuff.
Thank you, Astra. That was such a informative presentation and so visually helpful. So Astra Taylor will be able to take questions from participants. So please feel free to type in your question. As people are typing in their questions, let me just quickly introduce myself. I am Dr. Aparna Sinha. I am an assistant professor in culture and communication at CSU Maritime Academy. I'm here in my brown cisgender body wearing a gray shirt with white stripes. Just a reminder to everyone, our themes for this workshop today was envisioning radical future and co-liberation, strategies for co-liberation. So with those themes, Astra, what would you say, what does our ideal future look like with respect to debt?
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, I don't know. I'm, an ideal future with respect to debt. I mean, I'm really committed to this idea that that these are questions that have to be answered collectively. And I think that's what keeps me so engaged in social movements. I mean, I love my work as a writer and writing my own books and directing films, but there's something uniquely intellectually satisfying about co-conspiring and figuring out these strategies for collaboration, as you put it. But certainly, certainly it's something very different than the capitalist system that we have now. But I don't think it's enough to just say, okay, so it's socialism, right? It's like, well, what would it look like? What would the actual financial arrangements be? And so some of the things that we invoke and that I really want to do more, think about, what right now we have a system where lending is predatory. We use that phrase all the time, predatory lending. And what does that mean? It means lending that extracts more than it gives you. But why do people borrow? I mean, part of it is that they don't have the ability to meet their basic needs, but also sometimes we need a lot in the present so we can build things that will enrich us in the future, right? You need a lot right now so you can build a school. You need a lot right now so you can build that green energy factory or whatever it is, right? And so that's why, so credit expands the possibilities of the present. So one thing we've been playing with is the idea of socially productive credit, right? Credit that is on fair terms. Another idea is, and this I want to give a shout out to one of my other co-founders, Hannah Appel, who's actually a professor at UCLA, who talks about reparative public goods. So in other words, it's not just enough for public goods to be universal. They also have to repair those past inequities. And so we could also think about reparative finance, finance that is also specifically structured to think about the damage done by the past and to do that. And so those, I think we do have to get into the nitty gritty of what are economic arrangements and how we would structure these terms. Because I don't know if there's really a world with, we're not just against debt all the time. There are lots of debts we want to pay. We want to pay climate debt as a wealthy country, right? We want to think about reparations and pay those. So again, this idea of reparative finance are there. But those are just broad strokes, because I really do think that those are the things we need to start thinking about together. And to do that thinking together, we need to kind of cast off the old way of thinking, cast off the shame, challenge these ideas that are encumbering us, like this idea that, oh, well, contracts are sacred. So you signed that student loan contract when you were 17. So you must, pay your whole life, even if that means paying 5 times the amount of the original principal. Right. As though someone who's paid off the principal of their loan and then some really needs forgiveness. I mean, come on, you've already, which is the case for so many people. And I will end this rant by just saying the federal government does not even know how much of that $1.7 to $8 trillion is interest. It doesn't keep track, so this is the ideal system we need is very different than the one we have, but the one we have is structured very intentionally as a form of wealth transfer, because the payments of debtors, ultimately, again, their assets are going into the pockets of investors, are going into the pockets of creditors. And so, this is by design. We are indebted by design. It would be amazing to build the power so that we can design a very different system.
That would be so great. Okay, we have a question. We have lots of questions. Kathy Jepson is asking, did the White House extend the payment pause for student loan borrowers?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. The payment pause, the White House likes to say nobody has paid their student debts. It's not true. There are a category of debtors with federal student loans that, because of these bureaucratic I don't even know what to call them, idiocies, right, are left out. So about 4 or 5 million people. And then if you have private student loans, which lots of people do, and again, disproportionately folks who are low income, they're still paying their private student loans. The payment pause is a Trump policy. So all the Biden administration has done is extended a Trump payment pause. Why is that interesting? Well, it's a low bar, but also they didn't even fix these flaws, right? They didn't even say, hey, how could we include these borrowers who are unfairly left out? So they have extended it multiple times. The first extension, they said, this is the final extension. It's a high priority for us to turn on payments. Then the most recent extension came right before Christmas. And in fact, the White House, I even got a call from the White House, which is not a typical thing for me, saying, hey, we are extending this. We hope that you are happy about this. And and we will be happy when they cancel all student debt. But I think it shows, what it indicates is they know that turning on payments would be deeply unpopular. I mean, what this payment pause has shown us is that the sky doesn't fall when tens of millions of debtors don't make their monthly payments. Why is that? Because the federal government does not actually need our money. It does not need the money from those payments. So why is there this ideological commitment to extracting wealth from people who by definition, don't have it? They're in debt. I think it's really important to say that, debt, people who have affluence, get college paid for them, right? Like if you're borrowing to go to school, it's because you need to. There's this idea, that canceling student debt is a handout to, affluent college educated folks. And you really, the evidence does not bear that out. The empirical research doesn't. So right now the payments are scheduled to be turned on May 1st. That's why we are protesting in April. We have actually been organizing a debt strike, which is a campaign of non-payment. We've really thought about this. I will post another link on to that, about we're not advocating for financial suicide or default. I defaulted on my student loans. It was not a good experience, but we are advocating for politicizing the inability to pay. So we're going to keep the pressure on, and I think we'll be very insistent this time that even if they extend the payment pause, which I think they very well might, that's not acceptable. We need them to go further.
Gotcha. Okay, so Cara Jones is asking about the payment pause. How can CFA in particular help with the efforts to get the payment pause on federal loans extended and full cancellation? How can we get involved, essentially?
Yes, well, that is the question. I mean, so we would invite you all first to be co-sponsors. Over 50 organizations have co-sponsored the April 4th action and the general cause. So, I'm thinking of organizations from Indivisible to Sunrise, various union locals, Dream Defenders, which are an amazing racial justice group. So we would be very, very, very excited to have CFA be part of that growing coalition. And then I think the place to go is to this faculty meeting, or hopefully another one, right, to really strategize what leverage do professors have uniquely, because I think at this point it is about thinking about the different constituencies and how they can push back against the stereotypes of who a debtor is, what institutional power you all might bring to the table. So I think that's the first thing is, co-sponsoring this action and the general demand of debt cancellation via executive action. Pick up the pen, Joe, sign this executive order, and then, strategizing explicitly with faculty from other institutions. And again, this meeting is on the 14th.
Got it.
And so we actually have a higher ed toolkit that I will also tweet out and share too. So we've made a toolkit specifically for academics that I hope would be useful.
That would be lovely. And I know a lot of faculty would be interested in getting involved. Dr. Tracy Salisbury is asking, why is Biden reluctant to even do the 10,000 wipeout loans?
I was going to say, if only I could know what was going on in his mind, but I don't really want to. It's interesting. Again, there are obviously special interests that are against this. Loan servicers, for example, who are taking a cut. They're not the most powerful industry that progressives are up against. This isn't, in my opinion, at all akin to going up against ExxonMobil or, fossil fuel companies who want to stymie Green New Deal. But so that plays I think a more modest role here than actually ideology, than this idea that's deeply entrenched that somebody like Biden has built his career around, which is, you should pay, you should have skin in the game. And this debt financing system is how we were gonna get a skilled work, labor force. And I think we have to really understand that student loan policy was was kind of labor policy. I mean, it was a really, in my opinion, misguided, destructive one, right? Because instead of saying what we need to do are make meaningful, well-paid jobs with unions that are, that, right? The idea was like, oh, well, the problem isn't the job market, it's the workers themselves. They need to be more educated and skilled. And so they should individually go into debt so they can compete better in what was ultimately like a failing market. So the people who built that system are still running it.
Mm-hmm.
They're in these agencies, they're there. And, when you hear Joe Biden speak, he invokes these, he's fixated on the Ivy League, I don't want to forgive the debts of someone who went to UPenn or Harvard. It's like, do the math. This is like a few thousand people comparatively, so I think this is, again, why we need to push back on those stereotypes of who, the average debtor is. 40% of people with student debt don't even have a degree, probably because they were working multiple jobs. I mean, this is the working class. The last thing I'll say on that is, in contrast to Joe Biden, who often articulates this kind of politics of resentment, polling shows that people without any college are actually more favorable to student debt cancellation than people who have college. And I think that's really interesting and important. People are not as petty as they're made out to be. I think the idea intuitively that student debt, is out of control makes sense to folks in this country, right? Because they're feeling pinched in all sorts of ways. And, I think if we could build on this idea, K through 12 education is public, it is free. It's not such a huge imaginative leap to think, okay, so then why isn't higher education funded in the same way? Why do our friends and family, and why do we have to mortgage our futures just for a chance to learn? But yeah, I think it's invest. I keep coming back to the word investment, but it's both a kind of, there are economic forces invested in the status quo, but it's also an ideological investment in the system as it is. We need to really just keep working and chipping away at that.
Yeah. We have a very similar question. Kristen Gallant and Jen Egan are both asking, there's this argument that people give that, we paid our student loans.
Yeah.
Why should everyone else get a pass? And so even a lot of faculty colleagues have that same argument that, students need the skin in the game argument. How do we counter that notion?
Yeah, no, it's so important. I mean, it's interesting because I was a student debt defaulter, and then I was someone whose situation changed and was able to pay them off. So sometimes I do like to come out the mirror, like, I paid off my student loans and I don't want anyone else to have to do that, right? Just because I suffered, why should other people have to suffer? I mean, I think sometimes people get frozen in time. Student loans were so insignificant, they weren't measured. The government didn't keep tabs on them until the late 90s. So again, going from 1 T-Day in 2012 to almost 2 T-Day in 2022, you have to really understand how this interest compounds, how the problem is. I wish I had this statistic on hand, but it's worsening, especially for borrowers of color, especially for Black borrowers. The thing is that and this makes sense, it's a lack of intergenerational family wealth. It's a lack of wage equity at the workplace. If there's wage discrimination, what this means, it makes it harder for certain people to pay off their loans. So 10, 20, 30 years off, they're deeper in the hole and more likely to default. And so there's great resources on this. There's a recent Brookings, there are some really bad Brookings papers, but there's one co-authored by Andre Perry that is good. I recommend anything by Marshall Steinbaum, who's an economist at Utah. There are so many sources that really, sort of contradict all of these arguments that people really just pull out of thin air because they're not empirically based. And again, I think that point I said where, things people talk about loan forgiveness, but folks, so many millions of people have paid back the principal and then some, right? And they're deeper in the hole than they were when they started. So I think when you start really waking up to the miracle of compound interest, you just see how just like how unsustainable this thing is for people. But yeah, I'll think of other sources. There's so many sources.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, so Kelly Anthony is asking, do you think Biden is buying time for midterm elections?
I wish that I thought that they had some brilliant plan. I mean, I'm not in their meetings, but we have our contacts I wish we had spies, but we don't quite have that. But there does seem to be genuine reluctance. I mean, there are people within different agencies who would sign it for him if they were able to. But there's also, there's been a lot of recent coverage about Susan Rice, for example, who heads the Domestic Policy Council, whose mother was instrumental in the passage of Pell Grants. Actually, she's, supposed, like, according to all reports, very much against debt cancellation. And it does seem that Joe Biden made these promises, but then when you hear him speak, right, he's you get the sense that he truly doesn't grasp the scope and the scale and the real demographics of the problem. So, I think there are huge arguments for the Democrats to do this before the midterms. Recent polling showed that 63% of likely voters, so that's both parties, support some or all student debt cancellation. I mean, it's wildly popular. And as I said, it's more popular with people who didn't go to college than people who did. It's very popular with people who did. It's very popular with Black voters. Another poll said that 40% of likely Black voters would consider sitting out the election if there isn't movement on student debt cancellation. So one would think, from the perspective of a Democratic Party strategist, that this would be a no-brainer because it doesn't cost anything. It boosts the economy. It narrows the racial wealth gap. All of these things I've been saying. And yet, you can see that there are a lot of people with a lot of influence who are, economists alone or whatever role they're playing against Susan Rice, who are pushing in the opposite direction. And I think it's because, this would be hugely significant, even with a radically inadequate 10K. It would be an act of mass debt cancellation in a country that is loath to give anything to the working class, right? And so it would show, just like this $4 billion of debt cancellation has demonstrated, it can be erased. It doesn't just need to be restructured. We don't just need a little tweak. It can be wiped out. Rich people get their debts wiped out all the time. This can happen for regular debtors too. And so I think there is the sense that it would be a slippery slope. And for us, that's a very good thing. For some people, that's a terrible prospect.
Cesar Abarca is asking, CFA has a student-led statewide group called Student for Quality Education, SQE. I don't know if you've heard of it. Do you have any suggestions on how to get a campaign going in our CSU system?
Specifically a debt cancellation campaign.
Yes.
Yeah, connect with the Debt Collective. There are people who specifically in our organization who are volunteers and staff who are dedicated to building our higher education connections and working on that. So I invite you to email me or to reach out through the Debt Collective website. But 100%, I think there are people who would love to strategize around that.
Okay. And then we have a comment from Kathy Jepson. A lot of my generation had student loans. In our case, the interest didn't start until 6 months after you graduated, and the loan themselves were much lower. What do you have to say about that? Like our current generation is a huge disservice compared to us.
Yeah, I think the thing is, every year the average student debt an undergraduate takes out goes up, and the average debt held by a borrower goes up, and so that historical perspective is really valuable. It was quite a revelation when I learned that the student loans in the beginning were conceived actually as loans you would take out mostly to make ends meet, Pell Grants, and the cost of school were lower. Maybe you could even work a minimum wage job. Minimum wage hadn't stagnated the way it has, and so loans were. You take them out, maybe that's how you paid your living expenses. But obviously, the dynamics have totally changed, and it's connected to these overall shifts in our economy, right? The overall concentration of wealth, the overall refusal to adequately fund the public services that we need. And so that's why, to me, in my mind, student debt cancellation is never just about student debt cancellation. It's connected to the whole question of how we organize our society, how we provision for each other, and what our responsibilities and obligations are to one another, what we owe each other as we try to build a more equitable world and an educated one. So yeah, absolutely. Things were easier. But even I think at this point, the Debt Collective, we really want that horizon. free education, not just a bit of loans, less loans, because as we've seen, what happens is that once you kind of open that Pandora's box, it just like goes and goes. But to really say, no, actually, this is something we all need and that everyone should have access to, in my opinion, at every phase of life, and so let's just fight for a radically different paradigm while also aiming to build power and provide debt cancellation along the way.
As an educator, I'm really interested in what are some of your important talking points. And Kristen Gallant is also asking, what are some of your talking points to bring up when you engage in dialogue with Americans who just do not believe in the cancellation of debt? What are some of your important points? I mean, I think I have these conversations with my students and colleagues, and I feel like I don't have enough sources to argue.
Well, I did one debate that if people want to listen to it, it was actually for the New York Times podcast, where I debated a student lending expert who, of course, was actually funded by the student lending industry because they almost all are. I wish I was in my prime of debate form for that encounter. I've gotten a little softer in the last few months. But yeah, I mean, I think one thing is, again, this historical perspective and to say, look, actually, this isn't the idea that student debt shouldn't exist isn't that radical. I mean, this is the system, if you go back to the public education in California, public education was free, but it was free mainly for white men. And there was, this, strange coincidence before the diversifying of the student body and the attack on public financing, right? But what we're saying is, in a way, let's build on that tradition, but in an inclusive fashion, and so that it can live up to its promise. But I'm just saying that to say this isn't actually like some idea with no precedent, right? And to point out, how what the people around us actually paid for school, right? I mean, I looked into it, and Joe Biden basically, essentially, there were reports that his law degree cost him something like $1,500. I mean, so I think this isn't something. This isn't ancient history. Again, student loans were too trivial to measure in the 1990s, and I think the question, what we have to push people on too, is to say, break out of this individual mindset that education is a commodity you buy and then you try to get a return on investment for it, right? Why would you, as a human being living in a society, I want there to be doctors who are general physicians, who are family physicians, who are not trying to maximize their profit. And again, empirical research shows that there's a crisis of dentists in rural areas, that there's a lack of doctors going into these, less remunerated fields and instead pursuing these specialties to pay back the hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loans they're incurring to go to medical school. So we want people to be able to be public defenders and not just corporate lawyers. And so breaking that out and trying to get people to think socially is, I think, one area we really need to point them out. But then again, then also there's the kind of wonkier stuff, which is, look, the government knows this money is not going to be paid back. If you look at its projections, it keeps adjusting them. So what we're doing is creating these broken systems of what are called income-driven or income-based repayment, where we're essentially kicking the can for decades for people, forcing them to carry this debt burden that creates a really high debt-to-income ratio, hurts their credit, makes it so they can't, get a house and build that wealth through those means. And then maybe 20, 30 years, it's forgiven, but after they've paid, the principal and then some. And so there's a kind of economic realism that we're arguing, which is face the music, cancel the debt, and let people get on with their lives, and there will be spillover economic growth. Right? I'm trying to argue in the terms of a skeptic, right? But that this is actually the economically sensible approach. Again, as I say in the animation, the estimate is that it would boost the economy by up to $108 billion a year and create jobs, because people would be paying money for other things, not to the federal government, and again, not have their credit scores being just crushed by these debt burdens. But yeah, I think that debate is actually worth listening to because we're very opposed. Well, not very opposed. What's interesting is even our opponents now admit like a bit of debt should be canceled at the margins, which is progress, I suppose, of a sort.
I look forward to listening to that. I think that will be very informative. If people have more questions, you're welcome to type in your questions. We have such a deep, entrenched debt culture in our country in every aspect. I mean, my parents, they were born and raised in India, and they raised me with like, oh my God, never be in debt, never be in debt. How do you feel we need to change? Do we need to change the culture of debt, and how do we go about doing that?
Not through financial literacy, which is like the main thing we're told, right? This is the idea like what we need is people to be more financially literate so they can be savvier consumers of credit. Because again, that slogan I opened with, the problem is not that, the problem is that we're denied the means to live. Right. And so it doesn't matter how savvy you are if you're making minimum wage of $7.25 an hour and rents have ballooned 25% in the last year, which is the case, like the math doesn't work. So in Can't Pay, Won't Pay, we mock a budget that was released by McDonald's. I can't remember exactly what was, but it was like, here's the monthly budget of how you should live on your McDonald's wage. And it didn't have food, So I think we need to change the relationship with debt by destigmatizing it, by helping people understand that the problem is systemic, and that the solution to the problem of medical debt or educational debt is not just disputing your individual debts or navigating them or handling them, but actually building the power to fight for the provision of these public goods. And so, in that sense, yeah, we are challenging a lot of it's an entire industry around kind of, financial personal management and stuff like that, that I think entrenches this idea that it's an individual responsibility and an individual problem. I mean, why, credit card companies, voice their services in quotes on people. I think maybe the laws have changed a bit and they're a bit more regulated, but just like I signed that student loan at 17, I was definitely getting credit card offers soon after. And so, yeah, I think we change our relationship with debt by changing the economic structures, by regulating these things. The usury, for example, is basically unlimited now. The Supreme Court repealed, limits in the 1980s, but that's something that should be socially controlled. No, you cannot indebt people without limit. Bankruptcy protections need to be restored and strengthened. All these are the solutions that we need to work towards. But again, we can't even start talking about those and building that power until we come out of the shadows and start talking about our real situations together. So the Debt Collective does something called Debtors Assemblies, which are basically story sharing circles, right? Where you get to hear other people. Again, that invisible element, that invisible debt is made public. Because right now, the fact is, people think that they're unique and that they're the ones who have messed up. And that's really not the case. I mean, the data shows it's a widespread.
Got it. Kristen Gallant is asking, does the collective also work with groups that are pushing for universal healthcare? I see a lot of crossover with these two causes. I agree. I see that too.
Yeah, it's interesting. So some of our earliest work, right after Occupy Wall Street, was focused on medical debt, and part of our strategic thinking was that it would be a good place to start because it's so obviously immoral. I mean, you can't think of a medical debtor as a consumer debtor. It's not that you say, "Oh, I just can't wait to take out a loan for that cancer treatment." It's a crisis. It's like your money or your life kind of situation.
Right.
It's a tough thing. I mean, the solution to the problem of medical debt, as the question says, and as I've said, is universal healthcare, which requires legislation. So that is a big lift. We have to do a lot of work to build the power to that point. We have been working on thinking about other strategies, some of which we're actually going to be piloting in the new year around the fact that hospitals that are technically nonprofit hospitals are not only bearing their patients in medical debt, but suing them for it. And so we're thinking about strategies that target hospitals, but also state protections for debtors, so we can start building the power to get to that horizon of a different public healthcare system. But so, yeah, we did some work early on with physicians for national healthcare. I can't remember exactly what their acronym is, but we're totally in alignment with that. And it's a challenging debt type because medical debts are owed to hospitals, to insurers, to small private practitioners. They're owned by debt brokers and by debt collectors. And again, as I said in the animation, a lot of what we call credit card debt is actually medical debt. And so that's really symptomatic of our patchwork piecemeal healthcare system and privatized profit-driven healthcare system in this country, that this debt is really spread out.
Yeah, we also have a lot of scammers trying to tell people that, we'll forgive your debt, and they're posing to be the federal government. And I really, could you talk a little bit about that? Why are they doing that? And how do they benefit from it?
Yeah, I mean, I actually wrote a piece a few years ago, I co-authored a piece in The Nation, because it was based on the fact that I got myself personally off of Facebook and I opened a different account through which I only engaged with the for-profit college campaign, right? And so what happened was, through that new account, I suddenly saw the ads that would be sent to someone with a very different demographic profile. In other words, in my previous account as Astra Taylor, I'd been seeing ads for American Express and Harvard or whatever. And in this new account, I was seeing payday lender ads and these scams that were horrific. And the idea is essentially they would masquerade as someone saying, yes, we'll get you loan cancellation from the government, but what they really want to do is get access to your banking account details and all this. And part of my journalistic mission in writing this piece was to get word of this to Facebook, and they absolutely refused to engage with any of the questions or ask about it. And it's very hard to track this. It's a challenge for researchers to track this stuff because these ads and solicitations are so targeted. So yeah, I mean, their incentive is that they are taking advantage of people's suffering, right? I mean, other people's poverty and desperation is an opportunity for creditors and for scammers, and the lines between those two are often really, really, really blurred. And it does make it a challenge to organize around this issue, right? How do you show people, yes, we're not scammers, we're real. And it's just taking advantage of people's despair, which is what the entire debt industry is, right? I mean, this is when people are, when these debt brokers are buying portfolios of debts from hospitals and then trying to collect on them. What they are is they're, profiting from pain. They're profiting from people's poverty. And that's what the system we have does. When you ask that bigger question, well, what's your aspiration? What's the horizon we're working towards? I think it's one where nobody profits from pain and where other people's poverty is not a business model.
Yeah. Okay, well, it looks like you've answered all of our questions.
I've answered all the questions.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Astra Taylor. Your presentation and all of your answers were so informative, and I feel so much more educated on debt issues in our country. I just want to remind everyone, if you go on our landing page, we have information about Astra's book, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. It's also the winner of a 2015 American Book Award. So I encourage you to check that out and buy it. And thank you so much, Astra. And thank you for spending this afternoon with us and informing us so much on debt.
Thank you for having me. And I look forward to collaborating with CFA members on this campaign and future ones. And we really need the voice of faculty in this, because you all are really, interfacing with students who are going to be bearing this burden through their lives, unless we can get this stuff canceled, which is what we need to do. And we are, I think, really close to moving the needle. So this is a really urgent time. So yeah, please do check out my Twitter. I'm going to post all the links there.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
that's so relevant to what we do and our students. So thank you. Yeah, we look forward to getting all of those resources.